Thank you all for joining us for the Academic Interviewing Strategies Workshop. Joining us today are Dr. Peter B. Gray, Professor and Undergraduate Coordinator, Department of Anthropology and Graduate Associate Dean Fellow, Dr. Tony Rappetti, Associate Professor in the Department of Hospitality at UNLV, Dr. Kim Barchard, Professor, Department of Psychology. They're going to discuss summarizing your current research projects, your teaching philosophy, and preparing other aspects for academic interviews. We're going to start with the panelists introducing themselves, and then we will open it up for questions. Tony, will you please get us started?
Sure. Sorry, I had to find the mute. It's in a different place in every program we use. I'm Dr. Tony Rappetti. I'm in the School of Hospitality. I have done this panel maybe 3 times. Sort of a mixture in the past. We've done sort of a difference between academic and non-academic interviewing. I have obviously have experience interviewing in the process. I did work at another university before UNLV, and I've been involved in dozens of search committees, whether as chairs or just a committee member, and then obviously on faculty committees.
Thank you. Dr. Barchard, do you want to take over?
Yes. So I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology. I've been on a few search committees. I've also been actively involved in the searches that are being done in our department and a couple of other parts of the university. This is my first time on the panel.
And I'm Peter Gray, delighted to be here. I've been on a number of search committees, including having chaired some for faculty positions over the years. I've been at UNLV since 2005. More recently, just last week, I was in a practice virtual job talk being given by someone who actually just completed her faculty interview process. And in the Department of Anthropology, we have an ongoing faculty search as we speak with the final candidate tomorrow. And interestingly, this has been a virtual process for that search. 2 years ago, we would not have envisioned that. That would have been an on-campus process throughout. So those are some of the things flowing through my head regarding academic job interviewing, and we'll all have more to share on this.
Very nice. So I do have some questions prepared. Participants, please feel free to unmute yourself or drop a question in the chat or directly chat me. That way we can get to really the points that you're interested in. And also for the panelists, I'll just state the question out and then feel free to jump in however it feels right, instead of like calling on one and then the next, okay? So to get us started, what is the difference between an academic interview versus a non-academic interview?
I can start. I have background in both. Prior to this, I was a corporate director of finance for gaming companies. So I spent a large portion of my years on the non-academic side, and I have spent 15 years, 11 of it teaching on the academic side. And so I think probably the biggest thing, the difference is on a non-academic interview, they care about your qualifications now. What do you have to get the job done? Obviously, they care about what you can contribute in the future, but they generally have a specific list of skills. We need you to be able to do A, B, C, and D. And in an academic, you don't even get really in the door unless you have those. And then they want to talk about your future. How are you going to be successful here? What are you going to be able to contribute to us to make tenure? If it's a tenure track, if it's non-tenure track, still, what are you going to bring to the university? Whether it's what future grants do you have? What does your research look like? So I think that's a little bit of a difference. Again, I don't want to undermine an industry. That's also very important, but I find that in industry, we spend a lot more time about what have you done in the past that got you here. And in academia, we sort of assume that that's a given. And then what are you going to do moving forward? I guess I'll end it there if you guys want to jump in.
I have little to add, and this is one of the limitations to be aware of the faculty with whom you might be speaking. Dr. Rappetti's in an excellent position, having had industry experience, but most of the faculty you might be speaking with don't have that industry experience to be able to contrast what she just did. My understanding of the non-academic interviewing process is quite limited, but compared to the academic one, a couple speculations might be the academic process just seems incredibly, I'll use the word stressful. The stakes are high. If it's a tenure track faculty position, these are quite competitive. And the steps may be twofold. So there might be an initial applicant pool that then gets whittled down to like a so-called long shortlist. Maybe there are 10 to 12 semifinalists, as it were, from whom additional materials might be requested. And then eventually maybe 3 to 5 individuals might be invited for on campus, or maybe now it's virtual interviews. But throughout, one was well aware about how competitive this is, and the stakes are high because from an institutional and department standpoint, they're looking at hiring a colleague who might be around for decades. And in turn, they're thinking, just like Dr. Rappetti noted, what is the agenda you'd bring? Are you, if you're applying for a tenure track faculty role, are you tenurable in approximately 5 or 6 years? And they're trying to make that, trying to answer those kinds of questions in part through the interviewing process that, to my mind, puts a lot of weight on all of this stuff, frankly, unhealthily so. And also, this is a really slow process. If Dr. Rappetti said, hey, you may apply for a job in September and maybe you'll hear in April or May, or maybe you'll just get ghosted and you'll never hear. In industry, that often works much faster. And yet for academia, this can be a slow, laborious process. So saying all that, I don't know if Dr. Barchard, you want to add to anything, but there's at least some things to think about.
I have nothing to add. I have no experience in non-academic interviews beyond like student jobs when I personally was a student. So I cannot comment on the differences.
Awesome. Well,
Can I
yeah.
do one quick follow-up? Because I think it's probably the biggest difference, is, as Peter said, the speed at which the process happens is ridiculously slow in academia. That is, for those of you that have had any type of industry jobs. So even before I came in academia, that was my background. Even when I was going to school, I had regular jobs. In industry, you don't have to post a job for 14 days, and we don't have that. So if they have a job opening, and you see it, you got to get on it. Academia, there's sort of a timeline. We'll start reviewing applicants on this day. And then the industry ones go much faster. So you might get ghosted in industry too. I find that academia is a little bit worse, but it does happen in industry. But you'll know right away because the job will be pulled down. Where in academia, we sort of pull the job as the process is starting because we don't want to continue to pay for the fees, and it's been closed off at a certain time. And nowhere in industry are you going to wait 6 to 9 months for a job interview. It just is inefficient in an industry, non-academic position. And so if that's a route you're going to go, just be prepared for a faster process. And in academia, be prepared for a little bit slower. And unfortunately, not hearing anything doesn't mean anything.
Thanks for that. This kind of brings us to our next question, and perhaps Dr. Barchard, that's how you pronounce it, correct? Barchard? Awesome. We'll take it away. So can you reflect, please, on the difference between a tenure position and a non-tenure position, which was kind of mentioned in the last answers, and maybe you can just kind of go into depth of what the difference is.
This wasn't a question I was expecting, and so I'm thinking about it. I don't think I'm the best person to start this question. The tenured positions, most positions when they're advertised are not tenured. Tenured means that the faculty have decided that you're doing good work and they want to keep you. And so then you become tenured. And so very few positions are advertised as tenured. They might be tenured track. And if they're tenure track, that means after 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, typically 5 or 6 years, then you'd be considered for tenure. And when you have received tenure, the purpose of tenure is to protect academics against unpopular views. So if they have an unpopular view, we have certified that they are competent in their field, and by awarding them tenure, this is a way of saying that their job is safe even if they say something that is not illegal or bad in any way, but sort of they went down to a slightly less popular path. This is per protecting free speech. My impression is that most people who get tenured are not the ones who did things that were particularly unpopular, because that makes it harder to get tenure. But getting tenure is a protection of free speech, your job going forward. Tenure positions that are not tenure track means that you will not be considered for tenure in the future. And so you'll be on a contract that gets renewed every year or every 3 years or every 5 years or every 10 years or whatever the contract is, but there'll never be a point at which you are said to be tenured.
And I can follow up too with a direction of higher ed has been increasingly recognizing the value of professional higher ed instructors. UNLV's version of this is so-called faculty in residence, or FER positions. So these are individuals who are not technically tenure track or tenured, but they are envisioned as long-term instructors. And we have one in anthropology. We have a search underway for another this spring. And the idea is that you might be teaching in, let's say, 4 or 5 classes each semester. Maybe you're involved in undergraduate mentoring, but the focus is on instruction rather than, say, research at a research university. And you'll see more of those kinds of positions. Like some of our PhDs minted out of our department have those kinds of roles. I'm thinking of one student who's at Skidmore College in upstate New York, who is in a similar sort of role. She's not technically tenured, but she's there for the long haul. She's clearly been successful as an instructor, and it's a far, far, far better gig than just being an adjunct at 4 places. So that, I think, is a role to be aware of that you'll see increasingly in higher education, in addition to the tenure track faculty roles.
And I'll just chime in. Our college has we're not half and half, but we hire both tracks. Some colleges don't, depending on the college you're at. We do a heavy load of both tenure track and non-tenure track positions, as we call them, first faculty in residence. And I think it's important as a graduating either a master's or a PhD looking for a job, you need to decide what's the right fit for you. Just because you have a PhD, I think we seem to push a lot that a PhD means you have to get tenure track. And I think through the process of getting your PhD, you might realize that that might not be the right fit for you. Not that you're not good at research, but maybe you don't like it as much as the teaching portion of it. So just something to think about, that, as you're going through this, you might see some really cool non-tenure track jobs out there that won't have the tenure track don't have a research component. So generally, at least in our field. And so they're just 100% teaching. You might do research on the side, but it's not part of your contract. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility sometimes with what you study and where you publish. And you're still promotable. Also keep that in mind, that you are promotable, at least at UNLV and other schools. You're promotable on a non-tenured track. You just don't get tenure. But like in our college, you still get you still get the title, you still get the bump in pay, and obviously you still have the seniority because of your years of service.
I would also add that there's an increasing tendency at universities to have people. So there's the distinction between teaching faculty who are not expected to do any research, though they could, and research faculty who are expected to do research along with their teaching and service. And the teaching faculty tend not to be in tenured position or tenured track, though at some institutions they could be. For instance, I recall that Simon Fraser University has tenure track teaching positions. I could be wrong about that, and that information might be out of date, but it could be that some institutions teaching only faculty can still be tenured, whereas the research faculty are traditionally have been tenure track and then are tenured, but there is an increasing tendency at universities that research faculty are on contract, that they do not get tenured. And there's also an increasing tendency for them to be on soft money, where part of their salary comes from grants. And so the distinction between tenure track and not tenure track is not simply a distinction of whether you do research or not. So read the job ad carefully to check what the expectations are for the position.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point that I think it's really important, because nobody told me this when I started applying. Everything we've said so far is US centric. If you're going to apply in Europe, for instance, they don't have tenure. They're contracts. So they're research faculty, but they're on contracts. And by contracts, they're sort of these rolling, but it's the tenure structure is not universal for every place in the world. So just keep that in mind when you're applying. I know when I first applied, when I was looking, and I was like, oh, it'd be kind of cool to work in Europe. And then I was like, but they don't have, literally nobody told me through my entire PhD school that outside of the US, and I shouldn't say I was looking at US and Europe, that tenure wasn't a thing. And so just keep that in mind. Doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's also important because I know of faculty who've jumped from the US to Europe and back to the US. And so the tenure will potentially come and go with that because Europe doesn't have it. So just keep that in mind. Nothing wrong with it, but I know it was a shock to me.
Thank you. What does a prepared applicant and interviewee look and sound like? And can you walk us through what the day of the interview might look like?
I can start us off. A prepared applicant is a future colleague. A prepared applicant is not a graduate student. A prepared applicant is not a postdoc. So you need to reframe who you are and who those you're interacting with should see you as. What does that translate to? You are a professional, you have a vision, including a vision that aligns with the job description. So if it's a tenure track faculty position at a Research 1 or Research 2 university, in which research is a heavy component of what's expected of you, in addition to teaching, are there undergraduates in large classes you're primarily expected to teach? Are they online or in-person classes? How many graduate students are you expected to mentor? Are they PhD or MA students? All of those things matter in terms of positioning yourself professionally to convince those with whom you're interviewing that you can do what's expected of that role. And if it's a tenure track position, do it so well that you'll get tenure and thus you're worth investing in. So that would be my succinct answer, and then others can unpack it.
Yeah, so I agree. An interview is, I mean, you want to make sure you have everything. Although, again, as I said earlier, we do a really good, I think, screening process in academia. If your stuff's not there, you're not even gonna get in the door of, so make sure to read the application very carefully. Some will ask for a teaching philosophy, for instance. Others will not. Some will ask for a diversity statement. Others will not. And if you don't have those in there, most schools won't bring you to the next step. And so make sure that, you've got all of that packet in there. And then again, make sure that, I think Peter's right. They're looking for a colleague. They're looking, because as it's been said before, this person is thought of as sort of a lifetime job. They're going to be there for years. And this isn't a, 2-year cycle like we might see in non-academic. They're with you forever until, you know, they decide to move on, which doesn't happen as often as it does in industry. And so they're really looking at the whole person in addition to their research.
So I agree with what Peter and Tony have said. In terms of the interview day, I would say that the interview frequently starts at the airport. That is very common for one of the faculty members in the department to pick you up at the airport and take you to the hotel the evening you arrive. Typically, candidates arrive the evening before interview day, sometimes in the morning, but in either case, you'll often get picked up at the airport. Um, then the next morning, in our department, we start with breakfast with the applicants. So some of our faculty members will join them for breakfast in the hotel, then drive the candidate from the hotel to the campus, where the applicant will go through a series of interviews with individual faculty members. They will also give a talk. If it's a research position, this will be a talk on their research. If it's a research position with grant expectations, they may also do a chalk talk where they talk about grants. If it's a teaching position, they'll often do a teaching demonstration. In addition to the individual interviews with faculty members and the talks, they will also meet with the department chair and with the dean. If there is a hiring committee for an interdisciplinary cluster hire, they may meet with that. The candidates may also arrange or want or request to meet with special groups. For instance, one of our recent applicants wanted to meet with the supercomputing center, so we arranged that. And so somewhere along the way there's lunch. That's part of the interview, and faculty members join the applicant for the interview. At some point there's a tour of the campus. Eventually there's dinner, and that involves other faculty members who come visit with you. The process might be one really long day, or it might be 2 really long days. What we've been doing lately is the second breakfast we let the applicant have by themselves. We do not impose on them for the second breakfast. There's also a meeting of graduate students, where the graduate students get to talk to the person they're thinking of as a potential teacher and mentor. And so it is an intensive process. In our department, applicants typically get 1.5 hour break sometime, maybe 2 in those 2 days, and a half hour before their talk. We give them a half-hour break before the talk to prepare for the talk, but otherwise very intensive, typically 2 days. I'd be interested to hear if there's differences in other departments.
I will pause and just ask for the grad students listening, how does all of that sound to you?
So I'm really listening closely because I have 3 upcoming on-campus invites, and the first of the 3 is tomorrow morning on campus at UNLV, and I think I'm extra nervous about it because the people I'm going to be interviewing with have been my advisors or mentors, and then my lunch with the grad students are going to be my classmates who have worked with me and or taken classes with me. So there's this what's the word? Not extra stress, but I want to make sure that they do see me in the role as a faculty member or advisor or teacher, and not just as Charlie, their classmate. So, what advice do you have I could do to kind of flip that role or flip the mirror and have them or what I can present to help them see me in that role?
Ooh, that was exciting. Congrats, by the way.
Thank you.
Those are all the stories we all want to hear and we love hearing. So that's awesome. Uh, to the degree you're talking about your research, you're talking about your agenda, presenting that as the person hired in that role and conveying that is important, but I hear what you're saying, and that sounds like that'll require some interpersonal nuance for which Dr. Barchard's in psychology, so she has a better handle on that.
Yeah, I also think, Charlie, I think it's important to note, go in there. It's going to be hard. I'm not going to minimize it. I find that interviews with people who know you are actually harder than interviews with people who don't. But go in there and tell them what you would tell them if it wasn't UNLV. Tell them what you would tell one of the other two places you're going. And don't assume they know something about you. And it, don't say, well, my research is on this, right? And that's going to come natural because you're going to think of, when you see them, you're going to think of them as, these are people I've had classmates with. They've seen my presentation, or these are my advisors. They know what my dissertation is on. So go in there with the intention that you don't know these people. It's easier said than done, but I think if you go in with that, it will help a little bit more. And the faculty should be coming with that face also, because there are going to be people in that room who may not know you. And so they're going to want to see it as a unbiased interview. So they should be asking the same questions that are asking all of the candidates, even though they don't know them compared to you. If that helps.
That was very helpful. Thank you. Yeah, I have kind of this plan. They're used to seeing me on a day-to-day basis in my office, and want to show them how serious I am. So I went and bought a new suit, and just the different things to really show them how serious I am, and then obviously present them the stuff they haven't seen, or that my students have, and so yeah, that's the plan. But thank you for, I wasn't just being unnecessarily more nervous about this one. Thank you so much, guys. Yeah, I'm excited, the out of town, I think, yeah, there is less pressure because I get to make that first impression.
And every school is going to be a little different. We also have about a day and a half interviews. We have not had only thing we've hired since COVID started have been 1-year contracts. So those interviews have been not really interviews. So this time around, we just posted for 3 coming up for fall, and we haven't started that process yet. At least I'm not on the committee. So the people haven't come to campus yet. We're too early for them to come to campus. They'll probably be March or April, May. So I don't know how that's going to affect with COVID. Like Peter said, some of them went to Zoom. We didn't have any openings at that time, so we didn't do that. But prior to that, we had our day and a half, and we had depending where they're coming from, we generally start with breakfast and do a whole day, including dinner. And then the next day we do breakfast again, half a day, bring them to the airport. And they meet with the chair. They meet with, so the chair of the department, the search committee, usually multiple times, the chair of the search committee, the dean or associate dean. Ours also meet with the associate dean of research and academics. And then depending on the position, if it's a first tenure track, that'll be sort of all of the administrators, but then you'll meet with faculty, like they said, grad students, and we require a teaching presentation and a research presentation if it's a tenure track position. If it's a non-tenure track position, we just do the teaching. That communication is done ahead of time. We tell them what chapters they're on we tell them what class, what chapters they're on, what book. If they need a copy of that book, we can grab, get that for them in enough time so they can put their presentation together. And the dinners are generally with the committee, the search committee, and the lunch. We have one lunch with the grad students, so we make that a little bit less formal. And then our breakfasts are usually with either the search chair or one of the associate deans, depending on who's picking them up from the hotel and that sort of thing. So it's pretty similar process, I think, from what you guys are talking about.
Is there anything that I should be prepared that maybe they haven't already told me I should bring? So I bring in a teaching demo and a presentation on my teaching philosophy, but is there anything else that for this long day that I'm going to be kind of bouncing around and doing things that I should be prepared to kind of have other beside a water bottle?
So yeah, a water, I think it wouldn't hurt to have copies of your Vita. Um, I I am always surprised at how many faculty come into these interviews and they haven't fully looked at the resume. Or they've looked at it and then they walked away, but there was something on it that they wanted to question, but then they didn't bring it with them. And so if you have a couple of copies to hand out, it couldn't hurt. Obviously, you can't do that with a research presentation or a teaching. But I don't think it would ever hurt to have a copy of your Vita. And like you said, water is absolutely important to have, or something to drink to have with you through the day.
I would say that many of the applicants that we have interviewed recently have gone to the trouble of learning about the faculty in the department, so that when they show up in my office to talk to me, they already know things about me personally, even though I am not related to their research area. And I don't know that this is a good use of their time. But I think that many faculty are impressed by that. And those are the faculty who are voting. And so anything you can do to impress faculty is probably, not a bad thing. And that would not be nearly as impressive if someone pulled out a pile of paper and said, I looked this up and took notes on you. That wouldn't be as impressive as the fact that they're carrying it around in their heads. And so when one of the questions I've been asking lately is, how do you see yourself fitting into UNLV? And the applicants invariably tell me about how their research interests are related to those of other faculty. So they have done the work to know how they would fit into UNLV, how they would be colleagues. And so so I would say a lot of the preparation is already knowing the department and the program so that you're not asking questions that can be answered by the website. And so that you have demonstrated that you're really quite interested in that program. You're so interested and so motivated and so dedicated that you have gone to the trouble of preparing yourself by learning about the program and the faculty.
Very nice. It's also interesting. Okay, so I have another question. What kind of questions should the interviewee ask? What should they not ask? And perhaps, do you have any interesting stories, whether you were the interviewer or interviewee, that highlight what an interviewee should or should not do?
Well, in terms of questions, and Dr. Barchard a moment ago, I think allows those of you watching to picture this kind of interaction. You will have one-on-ones with faculty, also maybe group meetings with the search committee, group meetings with graduate students, and you'll want to come in prepared to know, what's appropriate, what's not within that scope. So don't try to ask about dirty laundry. Don't try to ask, is Dr. Rappetti as great as her reviews are online, or is there some politics going on here? Like, what's going? Leave that stuff aside. You just won't know. That is not stuff you want to get into, and you might end up. That could be its own question and subject for further discussion. But expect questions such as, "Tell me about yourself," and have your quick elevator speech that you can adjust to your audience. So let's say you're talking with an administrator en route from one place to the next, you got 30 seconds. That answer is going to look and sound very different from one given 4 minutes with a one-on-one with a faculty 30-minute session. So be mindful of adjusting your message. Don't mind repeating your message. To echo something Dr. Rappetti said earlier, to you, Charlie, pretend like no one's heard it before. And even if you feel like you're saying the same thing to 7 different people, they may not be talking. Moreover, it's okay if you said the same thing in your initial application materials. They are not going back to read that stuff. So they don't remember what was in that, or at least most of us don't. So just pretend like it's fresh. Just be straightforward and let them know what you can do and why you're the fit. And expect questions too, such as, do you have any questions of us? And always have at least one question. It looks poor if you don't have any questions, because it suggests you haven't done your homework very effectively. So those are a few bits of advice. One story that stands out for me is years ago, some grad students commented on an applicant who didn't wear socks. I don't know why that mattered. It did not matter at all. But for some reason, the grad students got obsessed with a candidate not having socks.
I think that's a good example of how the graduate students are just as invested in the hiring of good faculty as the faculty are, because the graduate students are thinking of this as a future teacher and mentor. And so as an applicant, you should think of every interaction you have with the department, whether it's the staff or the graduate students or the faculty or the chair, also the dean, as being relevant to your application. You should be on good behavior at all times, whether it's in a formal meeting or a job talk or walking through the airport. You should be on good behavior at all times, because if you do something strange and unexpected, it will get talked about. And if it's considered bad, they will be talking about bad things related to you, and that may influence whether or not you get an offer.
And I'll follow up with a couple of things you can ask about that I think show your interest. One would be, I think it's okay to ask funding questions. I know when we came to UNLV, in our college, there was an initial small amount of additional funding for first year to sort of get them kickstarted. So it's okay to ask for that. I think it's okay to ask about resources. So if you study a certain area, so in our field, in my field in particular, there's a certain database we use. Not all schools, it's a very expensive database. Not all schools have it. And so if a lot of your research is coming from that database, it might be worth asking the school if they have it. That also shows that you know what your research stream is and what you're going to be doing in the future. So I think asking about resources like that. We are not a lab oriented, but if you're coming from a lab-based type of school, that's important to ask about from a resources perspective. So I think those are good things to ask for, just general. I also think this sort of shows your research. Do some digging into the website. Maybe look at the strategic plan of the college. Maybe look at, and then come up with questions that are based on that. I read in your strategic plan this, or whether it's the college or the university, because that will show that you've done some research on where you're going. And so I always have to have I like to have one of those in my back pocket, just so that I can, if there's a lull in the talk, plus I always want to make sure they know that I've done my research. And so I think those are good things to ask about.
Thank you for that. The next question, is there or will there be an opportunity to discuss salary and perhaps negotiate for more benefits? And maybe what's the appropriate way to go about that?
I can start. So in our college, the only person that can make that decision is the dean. So the search committee has no control. They might tell you it is not common in our college to say a salary range in the job description. I don't know how others are, but talking salary in our college with anyone besides the dean is probably not, or the associate dean who's making the job offer. So know who's making, maybe the top two, but having that conversation with the search committee or faculty, in my opinion, can only go wrong. Especially because of the structure that we have in academia, where people come in at a certain base pay and we don't get raises based on so you could hurt someone's feelings. You could be coming in at a rate that's higher just because that's what the market's demanding right now than somebody who's currently sitting in that room interviewing you. So I think it can only go nasty, but I understand it's an important question. I just think you want to make sure you're talking to either the dean or the associate dean, and you'll be able to tell by the conversations, because they'll probably bring that up. The person who has the right to sort of negotiate salary will bring that up. At least that's how our college does. I don't know if others find the same.
So in our Department of Psychology and the College of Liberal Arts, our department chair discusses salary with candidates, but has no power. And so the applicants will talk about salary with the chair, and the chair will talk with the dean and the university, and they'll see if there's any negotiating possibilities. But I agree that applicants should not talk salary with faculty members.
And that brings up a broader question of what and when should you discuss any negotiations? And I don't think there's a precise formula that applies universally, but some of this stuff might just better wait until you get an offer, and then you might get into a discussion about salary. Some of you may have the two-body problem, in which it's not just you, but you have a partner with whom you're trying to coordinate the geography, which is always a challenge in higher ed. Do you want to be upfront with faculty you're talking about, or grad students with whom you're talking in a department about some of those things? Perhaps just don't go there and let that be part of a subsequent discussion. You know, that itself can be its own topic for discussion. And then things like the resources. So let's say you want a new lab that requires a lot of space, expensive equipment. At what point do you bring that up? Perhaps you wait till you get the offer and then you're in a discussion, and you might find, frankly, you can't do your work at a particular place because they don't have the resources, which gets back to the variation in institutional missions. Dr. Rappetti gave an example of a database available to UNLV folks that probably isn't available some other places that perhaps you're interviewing, and then you're asking about resources. They may not be able to offer some of the amenities you feel like you might want. So that's the institutional variation to be aware of as well.
And I will follow up really quick. Salaries are important. I'm not minimizing the fact that, you know, that it's important. Most of the schools, especially if it's a public school, that information is publicly available. So if you want, I mean, if you Google UNLV faculty pay, you can see what everybody makes in a department. Now you'd have to do some research on, okay, how long have they been there? And so you can have an idea before going into an interview if that college is going to be within the realm of what you need to, so that you're not going through the process and then go, well, they're, you know, half of what everyone else is, or something like that. So you can do some research prior to look some of that stuff up, so that way you don't necessarily have to ask it, but you at least have an idea before you go into the interview.
Thank you. How would we know who is in the search committee? Is there any way to know?
So for us, we only advertise the chair. That's who your documents will be addressed to. But during if you get to the first interview, during that first interview for us is with the committee. And all committee members should be there. They might even tell you ahead of time hey, we'd like you to meet with the committee and here's who they are. I would recommend, if they don't, and they send you an email or a phone call, hey, we'd like for you to meet the committee, ask them, who am I meeting with? So that way you can do your research before going in on the committee members that you're talking with, so you can make that connection. But prior to, again, in our college, prior to having that initial contact that you have been made it through the hoops of you get an interview, a Zoom interview, you're not going to know anybody but the chair for us.
For us, we've been doing Zoom interviews before on-campus interviews, and so the Zoom interviews involve the entire search committee. But before we did Zoom Zoom meetings, there was no information about who was on the search committee that was ever really given to the applicants. In our department, hiring recommendations are made by the entire faculty. And so the search committee are obligated to read the materials, but the materials for applicants that we interview are available to all faculty members, and all faculty members discuss the qualifications of the people we interviewed and get to vote on it. So in some departments and some universities, the search committee are the only people who are reviewing materials and making a recommendation. And in other departments and universities, the entire faculty in that department or in that college will have votes. So search committees might have more or less influence on the process in different locations.
And I'll follow up, excellent points, with a related point regarding the politics of this. You don't know who the folks voting are, and different departments, different institutions have different norms. In one place, it might be that the whole department weighs in with each vote equal. In another place, it might be that the search committee is comprised of those who have the most vested interest in the outcome of a search, given potential synergies with the program or research expertise or research specialization. And in turn, they get more of a vote or all the votes. So you don't know that stuff necessarily. And in turn, be mindful that everyone you speak with might be voting, they might not be, but treat all people well, because you are on from the moment, as Dr. Barshard said, you land on the airport tarmac, and then talk to your first person in the airport to the time you exit. So the politics of that. Then I see a question posted in chat. You've also seen some other questions and responses in chat. Deanna asks about number of classes you should teach, publications or research projects to have completed before potentially interviewing. Those are great questions. And succinctly, I'll just say the answer would vary by field, by type of position, by type of institution. So there is no one size fits all response. And what I would encourage you to do is take that mindset and do some online explorations. You can find a sense across just through Google searches and a lot of resources that are now online, whereas 10 years ago, this stuff was hard to find. You had to just ask people. Nowadays, you can find a lot of guidance online. Also, look up subreddits for higher ed or these kinds of subjects. You'll see some horror stories as well as fascinating surprises. But you can find a lot of stuff to help explore that, and then talk with your mentors. I would suggest too, to have a concrete sense of the expectations that'll make you be competitive at the time you might seek to be applying. One last thought, I know we're going to be running up against time shortly too, is with respect to the interviewing process and questions to ask and so forth, I just want to underscore, and this is true for Charlie tomorrow as it is for all of you, it's a two-way process. Some of these places you might be interviewing with, you might not want to work at, and there might be reasons someone has worked at a place and repeatedly they've had a hard time keeping talent because people have said this is a toxic place. So while you don't want to probe directly, like, is this a toxic department or institution to be a part of, you can be very perceptive to the things you're hearing, the subtleties from faculty and students and others in ways that might be informative, in addition to what you can probably find online in terms of comments and stuff. We don't have really the equivalent of a Glassdoor for higher ed. Niche might be something like that. But you want to be mindful too, is this the place where I want to spend a lot of my future years, and do your own probing in the questions you're asking with respect to helping shape your understanding of the culture, the expectations, and the future life you want to have, and whether you see it in that context as well.
Thank you. I think we might have time for one more question. If any of the participants have anything they want to ask.
I want to ask a question of Charlie. Charlie, after you're done, what do you do? Do you ghost everyone you've talked with, or do you send a thank you email? Do you actually send a snail mail letter to each person that's 2 pages in length? What do you envision doing?
Oh, that's actually what I was writing out in the chat. So I was going to ask your best advice. How, say they all go great, they feel really good, and I want to kind of just put the cherry on top. What's your best advice for follow-up time frame, and what type of follow-up I should anticipate? Or, and then maybe even the opposite. Maybe it goes really poorly and I'm not interested. Because I hadn't thought about that until you had mentioned it, that there might come an experience that I say, maybe I don't want to work here when I'm in that in person. So yeah, what do you have for me?
So I think that whether it went good or bad, the answer is the same.
Okay.
You don't ever want to burn that bridge because you don't know where you're going to encounter somebody. So even if it went horribly and you would never work for them, you still do the same things you would do, at least in my opinion, because the environment might not have been a fit, but you never know when you're going to cross paths or when that environment might change and you might want to go back there or so I just wanted to mention that. I'm still a believer in thank you. But I'm not old school where it has to be a note. I think an email, and usually within 24 hours. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciated talking to you. And then point out a couple things that you learned during the process. I really, learned about this or enjoyed hearing about this, or I'm excited about this. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Again, you can reach me at, this email and this phone number. So don't make it too long. Make it sort of, and if you want to do one, and you don't have to. So I've been on interviews. Well, I've been ones where I get them as a search committee chair, that I only get them when I'm the chair, or I only get them when I'm on the committee. So I'm one of that group of 3. And then I've had other candidates who interview every faculty member they met with that day. So you have a little bit of an advantage at UNLV because you're going to remember all of them. But when you're going to a new place and you're meeting potentially 20 new people, it might be a little harder. So you can maybe ask for cards or like make a quick note when they leave the room of, so when we talked about what should you bring, paper, pen, to write notes and questions on, and maybe write a quick thing about their name so that way you can look them up on their website later if you forget their, and then just shoot a quick email. It was nice meeting you. Thank you for your time. I believe those go a long way.
Well, I'll remember what you said about not knowing who's actually making the decisions. It's not necessarily just the search. I made it through the search committees, I guess, is kind of what my advisor had told me. He said, "Hey, the search committee is now letting you be presented to the rest of the faculty and staff, and those are the people that are really making the decision." So I made it through some filters. Now I've got the pressure really is on. It's definitely very different. I worked industry jobs for years before I decided to go back to college and then eventually to grad school. And it's completely different. I've never applied for a job and waited 6 months to get an interview and then another 5 weeks to say, hey, let's do another interview, and then another 3 or 4 weeks to say, hey, show up and we'll wine and dine you for a day. But the whole time it's just gonna be them evaluating me. So it's a little nerve-wracking.
We're all wishing you the best of luck, Charlie.
Thank you. I'm excited. I know I've been told that I'm in a fortunate position to actually have three opportunities. If one doesn't work out, I'll have learned from that, and the second one will get any better, just get better as I go along and hopefully get one of them. Yeah. All my
Awesome.
classmates are in the same position. I have a dozen of them graduating, and we're all out here looking for jobs. And I really appreciate this type of workshop where we can be candid and get your feedback from the committee's point of view or the faculty's point of view.
Yeah, thank you very much for being here, everyone. Um, and we're out of time now. I did drop a survey in the chat. If you all wouldn't mind taking a moment just to fill that out, it really helps us with our programming and planning of our programming. I want to thank each of our panelists for sharing their time and expertise with us today, and thank our participants for joining us. I know you all have very busy schedules, and we appreciate you being here. I hope everyone else has a great rest of the day. Remember, this will be available on the Graduate College YouTube channel for your future reference. Thank you, everyone. Good luck, Charlie.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.